Welcome to the Power of Purity podcast, the show that empowers men to experience their sexual gift in a healthier way. Now here's your host, Tony Ingracia.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Power of Purity podcast, and thank you for being with me today. And I do pray that today's episode will be a blessing and an encouragement to you as you continue forward on your journey of purity. And what I wanted to do today is to share a letter with you guys that I received that I thought was very powerful and very moving, and I felt just a deep sense of compassion and empathy for this brother. And man, could I relate to the things that he's writing about in this letter, because he's asking for some advice and guidance concerning the reality that his wife does not want sex. His wife is not interested in sex as much as he is. And of course, this creates quite a dilemma in the context of his own heart and in the context of the marriage. So he wrote me this note, and he's asking for some advice and guidance. And as I thought about this and prayed about it, I began to make some notes about what I would share with this brother, and I almost immediately knew that it would be very hard to write back to him a response, because I'd have to write pages and pages to convey what I wanted to say. So I decided that I was just going to do a podcast episode to speak to this letter and to share my thoughts and ideas concerning it. So I did write back to the brother and tell him, I'm not going to respond to your letter in writing, but I am going to respond via the podcast. So I'm actually going to do an episode or two. We'll see how this goes in response. And so I told him that he could look forward to an episode in the near future in response to his letter. So I think the best thing to do would be to start off by just reading the letter to you guys. So here it is. He says, "Hello there. I've been married for almost 15 years to the love of my life. We have 3 amazing young sons, and we all love and follow Jesus. For a long time now, I have been searching and seeking for answers from God and looking for support and feedback and perspective from other Christian husbands on sexual issues, specifically what men do when their wives just aren't into sex very much. I yearn for my wife, and I know she also loves me, is attracted to me, and we have a vibrant relationship, but she has very little desire for sex and is just fine cuddling at night. Early on in our relationship, we made love more frequently prior to kids, but she has communicated to me that most of that was to make me happy and not because she enjoyed it as much as me." Before you read too much into that last part, I work really hard to work on real intimacy to make sure our actual relationship is healthy and fresh so that physical intimacy can be a natural byproduct. And I'm very attentive to her needs sexually, and actually find it most exciting to meet her needs over mine. I know she is tired and needs more sleep than I. I know women naturally think about sex way less than us guys. I'm in psychology for the last 15 years and understand all the facts and data. What I'm having a hard time with is not just the once per week, on the weekend, if the kids cooperate and we can make love during the day stuff. It's what to do with my sexual desire for my wife when she shows little to no interest and I'm left laying next to her in bed, usually naked. I don't want to masturbate because I almost always need an image to do that, and I don't want to look at porn. Biologically, I need a release, but it's deeper than that. I want my wife. I'm not just horny. I have a lot of married Christian brothers, but everyone is busy with their own lives, and it's hard to find a place for these private but very important conversations and to find accountability, support, and perspective on these things. I just want to know what others do when they experience this. How do they cope? What is their perspective on sex and variance in drive between them and their wives? How do Christian couples reconcile 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 1 through 6, about our bodies belonging to our spouse and not depriving one another except for a mutually agreed upon time and reason. My wife doesn't buy that. She says it's misogyny, or only relevant for the historical time that it was written. Of course, I'm never going to force my wife to do anything, but I also agree with the Word when it talks about married sex keeping men from temptation and lust. And I don't want my wife to feel obligated to make me happy. I want her to be turned on and to want to make love to me. Please help a brother out. Any resources or forums, chat rooms that you can point me to would be much appreciated. Thanks and blessings on you. And again, let me just say that I think this is a very significant letter. Unfortunately, I think it's a letter this brother is speaking to that a whole lot of people could relate to, because I think these struggles might be more common in the context of a lot of marriages than we realize. We know that it's very common that the partners in a relationship have a disparity in the level of their sexual desire, and it's not unusual that one partner have a higher sexual desire than the other partner, so there's virtually always a higher desire partner and a lower desire partner, and this can lead to real difficulty, and especially in a situation like this where it appears the wife has little to no sexual desire or interest or appetite, and that can be profoundly difficult. And so I actually came up with 8 different thoughts or 8 different principles that I want to share with this brother in response to this letter, in the hope that it might encourage him and help him and point him in some kind of a direction on how to manage this. Before I get into my 8 principles, though, I wanted to make just a couple comments on a couple things that he did write in his letter. In the very first sentence, he said that he's been married for 15 years. They have 3 amazing young sons, and we all love and follow Jesus. So I just want to say I think that's totally awesome. Apparently, this is a Christian couple and a Christian family and a Christian home, and God is central to their marriage. Later on, he talks about Christian brothers at church and trying to find time to talk and all these things. He quotes Bible verses. So he is a Christian man, and I just want to acknowledge I think that's awesome, because when we bring God into the equation, I think it inspires hope and possibility, and the possibility of healing and redemption and progress. I can pretty much make a big mess out of my life, and the remedy is God. So the fact that this couple knows God and loves God and goes to church and they're spiritually minded, to me, it inspires hope. Because if both people in the marriage are Christ followers, disciples of Christ, and are open to hearing the heart and the voice and the mind of God on these matters, I think that it can be very redemptive and very healing. So I just wanted to point that out. In his second paragraph, this man says that he's been searching and seeking for answers from God and looking for support and feedback from other Christian husbands. And I just want to say that I think that's totally awesome, that this brother is seeking remedy and solution, and so he's turning to God. He's looking to God, he's praying, he's searching the Word of God, he's trying to find answers in God, he's trying to find remedy in God, and he's seeking advice and feedback and direction and input from other Christian men. So I just want to encourage you in that, brother. I think that's very beautiful. None of us are an island. None of us are our own source. I'm not a fountain of wisdom for my own life. And so when I have challenges and dilemma and situations to seek advice and wisdom and counsel and guidance from others, I think it's totally awesome. So I think it's really neat that this man is doing this. And even the fact that he wrote me this letter is an expression of his heart to seek information and guidance from others that might be able to help him and encourage him. So I think it's great that he's willing to do that. In the third line of his letter, he says, I yearn for my wife. And I think that that's something that's very powerful. and significant. Later on in the letter, he talks about how difficult it is when he goes to bed and he's lying there naked and he's interested, but it appears his wife has little to no interest, and so he's left there laying in bed next to her. And he says that biologically he needs a physical release, but the issue is much deeper than that, because he says, I want my wife. I'm not just horny. So I just want to acknowledge that. I understand how profoundly difficult that is. I think it's just very powerful. This man is yearning for something. He's longing for this deeper connection and intimacy with his wife. And I think one of the beautiful things about sex is that it isn't just about the sex. It's about being as close to the person that you love as you can possibly be, and being intimate with them and vulnerable and transparent and connected and vulnerable. And so I just think it's beautiful that he's expressing this kind of yearning for this deep connection with his wife. One of the things that Dr. David Snarch says that I really love, he says that the beauty is not in sex, the beauty is in people. And I just think that that's very significant. This man is yearning not just for sex, he's yearning for his wife. And I think that's beautiful. And the final comment I'll share, although I'm sure that many more things could be said about the letter itself, toward the end of the letter, he says that, of course, he's not going to force his wife to do anything that she doesn't want to do. And he doesn't want his wife to feel obligated to have sex with him just to make him happy. He says, I want her to be turned on and to want to make love to me. And man, can I relate to that? I think that is such a common, heartfelt longing for most men, that they want their wife to be turned on and they want her to want to make love to him. I interviewed a guest earlier on the podcast named Shaunti Feldhahn, and she is a best-selling author and speaker and intimacy expert, and she does surveys and studies data and all these kinds of things. And one of the things that she shared is how deeply significant and important it is for men to know that they are desired by their wife, and that there is no greater turn on, no greater aphrodisiac for a man than to know that his wife is turned on and that she wants to be with him, that she wants to make love with him, she wants to be intimate with him, and she's doing it not just out of a sense of duty or obligation, what we would call duty sex, but she's doing it because she wants to do it. And that is very powerful and very meaningful to a man when he knows that his wife desires him in that way and accepts him in that way and affirms him in that way. It's like she is accepting him and approving of him and affirming him in the deepest way that she possibly could. And when a man feels rejected by his wife or not desired by his wife, I think in a very real way, she is literally rejecting him on the deepest level that she could possibly be rejecting him. The deepest rejection of his personhood and his masculinity and his manhood. And that's something that's profoundly difficult for a man to deal with. And so I totally get it when he speaks of yearning for his wife and wanting to have this connection with her and wanting her to be turned on and her wanting to make love to him, not because she has to, but because she wants to. And with those few thoughts shared in the way of introduction, what I'm going to do now is just jump into a little bit of these 8 principles that I put down in response to this brother's letter. I thought to myself, what would I say to him? What in the world is he to do with this dilemma that he's facing in his life? Where does he go from here? So I thought of a couple different principles and ideas, so I'm just going to kind of work my way through them, and I'm just kind of thinking out loud. And I present these 8 principles not necessarily in any specific order, which means that number 1 isn't more important than number 4 or number 5 because it came before number 4 or 5. It's just 8 different thoughts in no particular order. So the first one is this. I just thought to myself, the first thing is to ask your wife what she wants or needs. If your wife has very little interest in sex, she doesn't seem to want sex, I hope you guys are able to talk about this and communicate about it, and to simply ask her, is there anything I can do that would help your level of desire? Is there something you need? Is there something you want? Is there something that if I did it, it would help you have more desire? Is there something we need to do together as a couple? Is there a preference you have? Is there something I don't understand? To appeal to her, to move toward her, to be open to her, to talk to her, and to try to understand her heart and her mind and her thoughts and what it is that she wants or needs. And then, of course, to try to offer that to her, to try to move toward her, to try to facilitate her desires and her needs in this situation. But with that being said, I do have one suspicion, and I'm thinking that this is a good thing to do, to ask her what she might want or need. But I'm afraid that it might not be helpful because I suspect from what he wrote in the letter that her response would be rather benign in nature. I'm not sure. I'm hopeful that she might have some specific answers that she could offer him to express what she wants or needs, what would help her have more sexual desire for her husband and with her husband. But I suspect, again, her answer might be rather benign, and she might just say, I don't want or need anything. That's not what this is about. I just don't know why, but I don't have that much desire. I don't have the interest. It just isn't important to me like it is to you. I can take it or leave it. You like sex more often, but I can live without sex. I don't need it. It's not that big of a deal to me. And he even wrote in his letter that early on in their relationship, they made love more frequently before they had children. But since then, she's communicated to him and admitted to him that even then, she was basically doing it and participating to make him happy because she knew that he liked it and it was important to him, but it just wasn't that important to her, and that she never really even enjoyed it that much. So although I do think it's a good idea to ask her, is there anything she wants or needs, that may or may not be helpful because she may or may not have an answer to that question. And it therefore brings me to my second thought or second principle that I want to share, and that is that I want to acknowledge that there is what I might call a tension between 2 significant principles related to sex in marriage. And those 2 principles would be as follows. The first one is the principle, the biblical principle, that husbands and wives' bodies belong to one another and that they should not defraud one another sexually. And of course, this is based upon the very passage that this man mentioned in his letter, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 6, which I'm going to go ahead and read. It says, "Now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. In the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command. So quite clearly, this passage in the Bible teaches us that husbands and wives' bodies belong to one another, that they should yield their bodies to one another, that they should be available to one another, that they should not withhold or defraud one another, unless it be by mutual consent, and then only for a limited period of time, which is to suggest that if a period of abstinence is too long, it's going to lead to undue temptation, and therefore they should come together again quickly so that Satan doesn't tempt them beyond their ability of self-control. So there is quite clearly this biblical principle that husbands and wives should be sexually available to one another. But with that being said, I want to mention the second principle, which I think in a very real way is almost contradictory, or at least creates the tension that I'm referencing in this point. And this second principle is that no person should ever be compelled, under any circumstances whatsoever, to have sex in violation of their own conscience or personhood, even within the context of marriage. So we just believe that this is absolutely true. Every person has an absolute right to their conscience and to their personhood, and if for some reason having sex is a violation to them, a violation of their conscience, a violation of their personhood, even sex within their marriage, sex with their own husband or wife, then that person should not be compelled or forced or coerced to have sex against their conscience or their personhood. So here's the problem, guys. What do we do with these two principles? It's like two sides of a coin, heads and tails. One side, we see the Bible says that as husband and wife, you should have sex with each other. You should be physically, sexually, intimately available to one another. You should not withhold and you should not defraud one another. But on the other side of the coin, we see this principle that no person should be forced to have sex against their will or their conscience. So these two principles are very, very important. They both make sense. They're both highly esteemed principles, and yet they stand in a way in contradiction or in tension with one another. And by the way, if I had to choose a proof text for the second principle, I would choose Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25. Ephesians 5, by the way, is the premier passage in the entire Bible about marriage. And 3 times in this passage, husbands are told to love their wives. Ephesians 5:25 says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her." So here, husbands are exhorted to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And because of that, what I'm suggesting is that a husband should not force or manipulate or coerce his wife into having sex if she doesn't want to have sex. If it's in violation of her conscience for some reason or her personhood, then I don't think forcing her to have sex would be loving her well. It's not loving her as Christ would love the church. So husbands are called to love their wives and to respect their wives. And so all I'm doing with this principle is acknowledging the reality that these two principles stand in tension with one another. Number one, the Bible says you should have sex with your spouse. But the second principle says that no person should ever be compelled to have sex against their own will or conscience. So I'm just acknowledging that point. And guys, that brings me to the third principle that I want to share with you in response to this letter. And it's the principle that a man is responsible for his own sexual purity and sexual integrity before God, with or without the help and or participation of his wife. And of course, I think most guys would agree that it's going to be easier to be a man of sexual purity if he has regular access to his own wife. And so most men, most husbands would prefer the participation of their wife sexually in the context of the marriage. But what I'm saying is that if for some reason a wife is not available to her husband sexually, in my viewpoint and understanding, that does not give the man license or an excuse to go out and act out sexually in violation of his covenant to his wife, his marriage vows with his wife. As if a man could say, okay, God, well, my wife won't have sex with me, therefore it's okay for me to go over here and I can look at porn and I can masturbate, or I can go to a strip club, or I can have an affair, or I can use a prostitute, or I can get a sex massage, or I can act out in any number of different ways. I can have cyber sex on the internet, because after all, my wife won't have sex with me. So it's not like Monopoly, guys, and you don't get a get-out-of-jail-free card. You don't get a pass. You don't get an excuse to be sexually impure. You don't get an excuse that you don't have to honor God anymore with your sexual gift or honor your wife because she's not available to you sexually. And let me just say that you guys have heard my story, but this is a big part of my own story, because as God was working in my heart and life, the fact is that my marriage was a complete disaster for many, many years. And as God worked in me and brought me to the place of my holy vow, God led me to commit myself sexually to my wife at a time when my wife and I were doing really, really bad, and my wife still was not available to me sexually, yet I made my holy vow that I would never, ever express my sexual gift apart from my wife. And I entered into a period of time that would last for 2 years, really over 2 years, where I walked essentially in sexual celibacy, even within the context of my marriage, because I was committed to being a man of purity and honoring God and honoring my wife with my sexual gift, even though my wife was not yet in the place where she could have sex with me as her husband. So the fact is, it's your responsibility before God to be a man of purity with or without the help and participation of your wife. And I know that I shared this with you guys sometime earlier in the podcast, but I wrote this little meditation one time, and I'm going to go ahead and share it with you. It's called My Sexual Purity is About Me and God. And I actually wrote this meditation one day while I was bow hunting. I was in my tree stand, and the sun was rising, and I was spending time with God. And I was not in a very good place on this particular day because my wife and I weren't doing real well, and we weren't having sex, or at least we weren't having sex anywhere near as frequently as I would have preferred. And so I felt mad at God, and I felt mad at my wife. And I'm thinking, God, this is kind of unfair. You expect me to be a man of purity even though my wife won't have sex with me. Like, this makes it really, really hard for me, God. And I felt God speak to me, and I knew what was right, and I know what's wrong, and so I wrote this meditation. And it says this: it's about me and God, my sexual purity. It's not even about me and my wife. It's bad enough the world in which we live in is so aligned against the possibility of my sexual purity. Lust, temptation, and opportunity everywhere, every day. That's bad enough. What would really, really help is if I could escape at least to the refuge of my relationship with my wife, like my own little Garden of Eden, a sexual oasis in the middle of the perpetual temptation that surrounds me every day. But even there, with my wife, there is much frustration, disappointment, hurt, confusion, and disorientation much of the time because of where she's at in her own story, her hurt and her pain in life. She simply is not available to me sexually in the ways that I wish she were, in the ways that I long for. So in a very real way, even in the context of my marriage, I am alone. There is me and my sexuality, and there's God, and sometimes there's my wife, but not always. So in the end, my wife is not the solution to my sexual dilemma. It comes down to me and God. It comes down to me considering the kind of man I want to be, my personal integrity, my moral equilibrium, and learning to be that man between me and God, with or without the support I would prefer from my wife. What many men do is use their relationship with their wife, or better said, their lack of relationship with their wife, as the perfect excuse they need to act out sexually, as if they're saying, if my wife was who and what I want her to be sexually, then I would not have to act out sexually. But since she's not, I therefore am justified in my acting out. This is the equivalent of making your wife responsible for your sexual integrity, when in reality it's your responsibility between you and God and not hers. In the end, my sexual purity is about me and God. So with that being said, you guys, I see that I'm out of time for this particular episode, so I'm going to bring this episode to a close. In response to this brother's letter, I have 8 principles that I'm going to share with you, and I've now shared the first 3, which were this. Number 1, ask your wife what she wants and needs. Number 2, realize there's a tension between these 2 significant principles related to sex in marriage. The first one concerns the 1 Corinthians 7 passage, which says that husbands and wives should have sex with one another. The second one is the reality that no person should ever be compelled, under any circumstances whatsoever, to have sex, even in the context of their marriage, in violation of their own conscience or personhood. And the third principle is the reality that a man is responsible for his own sexual purity and integrity with or without the help and or participation of his wife. And if you guys are able to come back next week to the Power of Purity podcast, I'm going to continue this episode where we will continue with Principle 4, and we will help this brother who wrote this letter hopefully gain some insight and direction toward the reality of his circumstance that his wife does not want sex. In the meantime, God bless you guys. Thank you for being with me today. Have an awesome week. Have an awesome day. And I'll look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye now.
Thanks for listening. Visit powerofpurity.org for more resources and information. And if this podcast has been helpful or encouraging, please invite a friend to listen. Until next time, remember, there's power in purity.